Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative questions of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Ali McMillan and I'm a Methodist deacon currently at Methodist Central Hall in Westminster. The role here at MCHW includes pastoral work for the church, as well as preaching and leading worship and helping to run various large events that the church here holds. I also head up work with the Westminster Food Bank and the Night Shelter, as well as St Vincent's Family Project, which is an ecumenical family-based project here at Methodist Central Hall, Westminster. In my previous role, I was in the Christchurch and Wimborne circuit in Dorset, where I worked to build links between the church and the community, and I worked with people of all ages. I grew up in Brighton, and before coming into ministry, I worked as a secondary and sixth form school teacher in Oxfordshire, teaching religious education and ethics. And as part of my training for ministry, I completed an MA in theology and transformative practice. I'm really lucky to live in Pimlico in central London, and I love exploring all that London has got to offer. I'm a member of a religious order, the Methodist Diaconal Order, and I follow a rule of life that brings a sense of rhythm and wholeness to my life. I'm passionate about coming alongside people where they are and journeying with them as they discover God at work in their life. I'm delighted that each week I'm joined by a guest from a different place and space on the pulpit and political landscape. And today I'm really pleased to introduce the Reverend Rachel Parkinson. Rachel has been in full-time ministry for 20 years. Prior to it, she was a factory inspector with the Health and Safety Executive, inspecting workplaces in West Yorkshire. She's currently chair of the Wolverhampton and Shrewsbury District, and from September will also become chair of JACEI, the Joint Advisory Committee on the Ethics of Investment. Rachel enjoys running, cycling, long distance walking and fusing glass. So a full and busy life. We're really delighted and thank you for joining us today, Rachel.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
We know that politics in the pulpit can be a bit of a contentious topic, but we also believe that it's essential to the world around us and that speaks into our churches. When you hear arguments saying that politics should not form a part of our preaching, how do you respond to that?
Well, I don't know what I'd say from the pulpit, really, Ali. I mean, I think the longer that I preach, the more I am less worried about delivering sort of perfect set-piece sermons. And the more I want to prize being sort of honest and authentic and struggling with what it means to be human in God's world. And so when I open the scriptures, I'm wanting to really do things which people will be thinking about during the week and find relevant, things, places where, that will scratch where people itch. And that's going to be political because life is political. I mean, even things that we think of as mainly pastoral issues often have political dimensions. So I would say, though, that I strongly believe, we are a church of contradictory convictions about lots of things. And we know that Methodists can have many ideas about how society can move towards the kingdom of heaven. And so they can, they can have different political agendas and follow those. That's all fine. But I'm always wary of abusing the pulpit by treating my own views as though they're gospel. But in that case, I find JPIT really helpful because my sort of rule of thumb is if JPIT have said it, then I can say it in the pulpit, which is great because it, allows me to explore issues that may be contentious, but I find that really helpful. So thank you for that.
Well, it's always good to have a plug for JPIT, and it's good that we have that benchmarking there to just guide us a bit as well. So from your context, what would you want us to hear as key justice issues or political events?
Well, I'm still moved by the fact that I went down on Friday to the big one, the climate justice demonstrations in London. I was there behind the We Are Methodists banner, but I recognise there was a large faith contingent. We met at the service at St John's Waterloo, which was called No Faith in Fossil Fuels. And but joining people, I mean, the intersectionality of the sort of crowd of people that were there, sort of scientists and doctors and vegans and people who wanted to save whales as part, just a glorious diversity of humanity, really, who obviously got together over the full 4 days. I'm really interested that Extinction Rebellion, who are heading it up, have changed their tactics so that they have moved away from disruptive protests to trying to get maximum involvement and large-scale numbers. And I think that makes it easier sometimes for church people to join in. At the same time, I note that despite the fact there were many thousands of people who were in London over the weekend, the impact that's made in terms of the media has really been very small compared to if somebody had glued themselves to something or sprayed orange paint all over Big Ben or something like that, So I think there are those real issues about how can we make a maximum impact, and if we're going to have rely on wide scale involvement, then lots of people have got to get involved, and I think that's people in the churches too.
Wonderful to hear that you were there and what's going on, and as you say, working with that broad range of people, and perhaps that thing about how we protest might be picked up in our readings a bit later on. Interesting. Well, each week I ask my JPIC colleagues for a little roundup of their expertise and what they think we might want to be keeping an eye on in the world this week. And some of their suggestions have been the ongoing violence in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, with the British embassy staff having been evacuated and looking to evacuate other British citizens from Sudan. New NHS figures revealing that ambulance crews are spending 1.8 million hours a year dealing with patients with mental health problems, with 1.2 million people waiting to receive care and treatment from NHS community mental health services. So real impact that's having on the NHS and also, of course, on those individuals. And then, as you've just mentioned, the big one, Extinction Rebellion climate justice protest. That's been going on since Friday until Monday this week. And as you've said, several organisations involved in that protest, including lots of different Christian groups. And just to note that on Friday, the 28th of April, is International Workers' Memorial Day. So that's happening this week. So those are some of the things going on in the world we might want to have a think about. And we're still in the season of Easter, of course, in our lectionary seasons. And our lectionary passages for this Sunday, the 30th of April, are Psalm 23, Acts 2, 42 to 47, 1 Peter 2, 19 to 25, and John 10, 1 to 10. So lots to get our teeth into. So with our metaphorical newspapers open in one hand, let's open our Bibles. And Rachel, I wonder if there's a particular passage or particular theme or question that you'd like to start with for this week.
Well, I think, Ali, just to go back briefly to what you were saying about the fact that International Workers' Memorial Day is on Friday. And as you said in my introduction, I worked in the field of health and safety for 17 years. So this is something that's really dear to my heart. And I was very moved. I was at a circuit meeting a few weeks ago, and at the end of it, somebody got a text to say that a member of a family that had come in for baptism had been involved in an industrial accident. It's the father of that family that had 4 children, and we all stopped and prayed for that family. And then the following day that we heard that he died from his injuries. And I've always had this very deep-seated belief that when people go out to work, at the beginning of a shift, they should come home safe and sound at the end of it. And too often that doesn't happen. If you wonder whether that belongs in the pulpit, John Wesley himself actually addresses it in his sermon on the use of money. He says very famously, we should gain all we can, but he qualifies that by saying, but we shouldn't do things, labour which impacts our health and safety adversely. So, we shouldn't do too hard labour, shouldn't do work which involves arsenic or lead. And he even talks about not sort of sitting writing too long or sitting still too long. I wonder what he'd make of our lives now they're on Zoom and answering all the emails. And Wesley says, if you're doing one of these things, then you should just swap it for something else. And I have to say, I don't know what the job market was like in Wesley's day, but it does make me think that's quite a short-sighted view, because so many people, so many of us are trapped in less than ideal working circumstances. You've just talked about the paramedics and so many people in emergency support services now that are cut to the bone are having to do double shifts and cover and work with ridiculous stresses, really, that then feeds into a vicious cycle of more and more people being off and so on. And we don't really focus on this much in our worship. I think maybe that's because largely we have retired people now, I don't know, but we this is really something that we can think about in our prayer and worship, because these working conditions are down to political decisions. This is the way that society chooses to organise things. So just a shout out really for the fact that I think International Workers' Memorial Day can prompt us to think about justice issues in the world of work. So that would be my first point, really.
Oh, that's really helpful. I have to confess, I had never even heard of Workers' Memorial Day, so I certainly will pick that up in our worship on Sunday. So thank you for highlighting that and the importance of it. Just holding that and not forgetting it, but holding on to it. But I wonder if there was any themes or questions from the different passages for this week that you'd like to pick up on.
Sure. I think they sort of fall into two categories, really. As I looked at it, we'll all look at them differently. But I think the Acts passage stands alone. And obviously in this season of Eastertide, we're working our way, through the story of the early church. And I always enjoy that because it's always both interesting and inspirational. So I think the Acts we can have a look at. And then I think the other readings are obviously linked together by this sort of shepherding theme. So I can maybe come to those in a while. But shall we start with Acts?
Yeah, let's start there. That sounds good to me.
Yeah. And I think when you look at that passage, the bit that jumps out of you when you're coming at it with political lens is thing about the disciples sort of selling all they have and sharing the proceeds. So this idea that there was a sort of socialist ideal in the early church, and of course if we skip forward a few chapters, we get Ananias and Sapphira who sell some land and don't declare all the proceeds and drop dead on the spot. And it says great fear took hold of everybody in the church, which I think is that quite the sort of the sort of reaction we were wanting, that everybody was fearful. But it's obviously a big thing. And looking around this, you can see that people have been very interested in whether this is a sort of description of an ideal church. Was it really like that? And people, I think, probably bring their own views and readings into that as they try to argue one way or another. It's obviously clear that if it did happen like that in the first fit of enthusiasm, it didn't last for very long. And we can see other places where, for instance, in the Corinthian church, there's obviously inequalities, because Paul's talking about some people bring a lot of food to the Lord's Supper and some don't bring much, and then they eat their own, so some go hungry and some don't. So there's that whole thing about how much was this true. But I don't think we ought to get sort of hung up on that, because clearly the idea was that in this new community, in the body of Christ, that division which you get when you get inequality of wealth should be addressed and should be torn down. And I think that's, as a preacher, something I would be wanting to particularly explore. I've been thinking a lot recently, actually, about how the cost of living crisis has really brought home to me, and it's been an issue obviously for a very long time, but been getting worse about the fact that we have such different experiences of life in the UK because there's such growing inequality. And I sit here in my manse in Wolverhampton, and in this district we have some of the most deprived communities in the UK, sitting cheek by jowl alongside more affluent areas. But a stone's throw from here, there are people who are just trapped in cycles of poverty. And I've been feeling more and more discomforted by not only what that means for their life and the possibility of living abundantly, but also for me in terms of my relationship with them, because we're just not sharing the same experience. So I would want to bring all of that discomfort and unease about the dis-ease in our society into this, looking at why was it that these first Christians, as well as singing hymns and sharing bread and so on, why was it that they decided that what they needed to do was to pool what they had? And what can that say to us today about the sort of communities we want to make?
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and that highlighting between the divisions between those who have enough and those who don't, and it just makes me think of the Trussell Trust current campaign around making sure that people can afford the essentials when it comes to universal credit, and I think highlighting some good work that's going on around this, but that challenge to us as well as questions about how we are living with or not challenging some of those complete differences in wealth that people have. That's really helpful. So is that enough on the Acts passage? I don't know if there's anything else from there.
Yeah,
we've got probably quite a lot to say.
I know you have to shut me up. I'm sorry, I could
not at all.
I think as well as looking at that, it'd be really good for churches to be able to look at the overall description of how that generous and equal and praising church, they had the goodwill of all people, it says. Yeah. And also God added to their number. So again, how can we be generous and so on? I think in terms of ways to mark this Sunday, wouldn't it be a great Sunday to have a love feast? Wouldn't it be great if you came together and you prepared food together? And part of a love feast is always having a collection of money or other goods to share. So that would be really good. Fits really well with Methodist way of life this week. Supernumerary minister in our district, Andrew Roberts, his Holy Habits is majorly based on this passage. There's lots of stuff there. And I don't want to move on without just mentioning I'm so enthused and proud of the Wolverhampton circuit, who themselves, as I've said, there's a lot of deprivation in the area they serve, but they've got this fund, benevolent fund, where if they hear of another part of the connection that is in need, this circuit, out of their need, because the story they link it with the story of the widow of Zarephath who gave to Elijah. She didn't have much, but she gave, and God kept on providing. They help out. So, for instance, in the Methodist Church in Wythenshawe, where they were making lots and lots of toasted sandwiches for families, but they could only make so many at a time because they'd only got, sort of a toasty maker that made two. Wolverhampton Circuit bought them a big sandwich toasted maker that could make sort of 4 times as many. And just in this last week, when they heard that the food bank in Stoke had been broken into at Swan Bank, they sent £200 to help the food bank get on their feet. And in terms again of this pooling and sharing, isn't that a fantastic example of nationalism? Really, really good idea.
Absolutely is. I mean, that is a wonderful testimony to how we can support one another in Christ, and as you say, an excellent example of that very Methodist phrase of connectionalism and how we work together as churches and circuits. So that's really wonderful to hear. So the second kind of theme that comes out of the other passages, you're talking about shepherding and how that might be a theme for us. So I wonder if you want to move us on to that.
Okay, I think the first thing that I'd want to say is that shepherds aren't mythical or romantic characters. People make their living by looking after sheep. And in the Wolverhampton and Shrewsbury District, we have on the east side the urban conurbation, and on the west side we go all down the border with Wales and over Wales, and there's lots and lots of sheep farming. So I think part of doing justice to these passages and to the world around us is to be based in the reality of a rural life and shepherding. If you have anybody who's involved in looking after sheep in your congregation, or you've got a link with them, you could actually talk to them about the rural issues that are around at the moment. We support the Borderlands Rural Chaplaincy, so very, very aware of rural isolation and lack of services, public transport services and shops and schools and so on and so forth. All the pressures affecting farming, the pressures affecting them being on the front line of climate change in terms of experiencing erratic weather, but also being under pressure to be productive, but also to rewild, and that's a big issue when it comes to sheep farming. So I think the first thing would be to do the reality check that this is something that people do now, and they have issues of justice that affect their communities. If you haven't got a farmer to hand, I might recommend a wonderful book by James Rebanks called The Shepherd's Life. which is about the Lake District, but again looks at a whole range of socio-economic factors as well as how you look after sheep. So that's, I think, the first thing I'd say is people look after sheep now, and the rest justice and peace issues. So remember the shepherds.
Really helpful for those of us who are in a very urban context to just be reminded of that. So yeah, absolutely.
Sure. And then I struggled a little bit more with these passages, I have to say. We've got the 23rd Psalm this week, and I think over the years, I've been preaching a long time. I've often struggled when 23rd Psalm has come up in the lectionary because it's so familiar. And I think the first thing a preacher needs to recognise is that if you use the 23rd Psalm in worship, a whole lot of people are going to be taken to the funeral of somebody they've loved, or some, that will be I think it's a really good idea to acknowledge that, so that people can say, yeah, and then we can move past it, to look at other lenses through which we can look at it. And an idea that I haven't really developed and I'd never thought of before is, as I read it last night, maybe because recently I've been to a theatre production of The Beekeeper of Aleppo. Have you read that?
No, I haven't, but yeah.
I'd really, really recommend it.
Yeah.
It charts the journey of a couple who have lost their infant son in Aleppo in the war in Syria, and how they make their way through Europe and eventually to the UK, and it charts their journey. And as I read the 23rd Psalm, and I was thinking about, lying down in green pastures and by still waters, and also then walking through deep valleys, it just came into my mind about their journey. So much of that was in the valley of the shadow of death, but sometimes just the kindness of strangers or particular small organizations, they just did that work which opened up just a place of rest and sanctuary. So I got quite excited about that, sadly for all sorts of reasons. I'm not preaching on a lectionary on Sunday, but another time I think I would like to do that, to look at the 23rd Psalm and look at those who are making journeys through different landscapes, and look at how, as followers of Jesus, we can accompany through deep valleys, and how we can provide those places of rest and refreshment. So that's, I think, how I'd look at the Psalm.
That's really helpful. I was when I was doing my reading around it, I was struck by that where it talks about goodness and love will follow me, that actually the word there could be translated as pursue, so that even as you're going through these dark valleys, that goodness pursues you through them. I think that ties in with what you're talking about, how we can offer places of rest and sanctuary to people when they're going through difficult times. So that reminder that God pursues us with his goodness and joy. That's really helpful.
Yeah, sure. And then I looked at the reading from the first letter of Peter, and I found this a really difficult passage. The first thing that I did was I've got into the habit of going to Singing the Faith Plus and looking at the lectionary readings from there. So you just click on the reading, and so you get the text, the verse to verse of what's in the lectionary. And there's a big bear trap if anybody does that. So I would just warn you, make sure you open the Bible and read what surrounds it, and particularly verse 18, which the lectionary leaves out, because this begins: slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. Now, if you start at verse 19, you don't get that first verse. And I think we can see probably why it's been left out. I think it's, for me, it would be really important to recognise that this passage has been massively abused, particularly by white slave-owning communities, in order to tell primarily black slaves that you've just got to knuckle down because we're in charge and that's ordained by God. And you've not only got to knuckle down if we're nice and kind to you, but even if you've got a harsh and cruel master, that's just your lot. That is just a terrible legacy, and we are, inextricably linked in that. And so I'd be wanting to say that first, I think.
have that acknowledgement of how this text has been used. I think it's really important, isn't it?
Yeah. So then I was looking at it some more, and it's a passage which is looking at saying that, if you do something wrong and you suffer for it, well, that's just sort of justice. But if you suffer when you're doing right, well, that's God will acknowledge that, because that's following in the way of Christ, who did no wrong, but who refused to just tolerate sin and injustice, and so went to his death and suffered the cruel and unusual punishment of crucifixion. And I guess maybe because I was thinking of the big one, and as we said, ways of protesting, and because of the background of verse 18, I was reminded of some stories from the civil rights movement, and a particular hero that I have that I think is very little known. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce him, really. I came to know him because one day my youngest son, when he was at high school and he wasn't going to church, and to be honest, he was often trying to put as much clear water between himself and the Methodist Church as possible, came home having had a history lesson and saying, Mom, I learned about this really amazing guy today, and he was a Methodist. And it took quite a while to work out who this was, but it's James Lawson, who's a minister in the United Methodist Church. He's still alive, he's 95 now. But he was a missionary in India, in Nagpur, and studying the ways of nonviolent resistance and looking at the way Gandhi had worked. And then he heard about the civil rights movement back where he'd grown up. So he went home. He went and saw Martin Luther King Jr., who said, go south. He went to Nashville, and he spent quite a long time teaching white and black students, college students together, how to suffer abuse, verbal and physical abuse, and not fight back. And then that led to them together making the protests where white and black students sat at lunch counters in places like Woolworths, which were segregated, and sat there. And there were amazing photographs, terrible photographs, of the students sitting there very calmly, and baying mob behind them, sort of pouring ketchup and mustard and sugar and anything they can find on their heads. But that work of non-violent resistance, of course, moved that society towards desegregation laws. So I just had that story in my head, and it seemed to link up with 1 Peter, the way it's been abused, the way we could see it in that context, and also looking at protest today. I heard something on the radio, which again was linked to the big one, pointing out that in Parliament Square, where the protests were, you've got one of the Pankhursts, the suffragette statue, and that 100 years ago, those women would have been seen effectively as sort of terrorists. They were imprisoned. And just the question about the way that as a society we are treating climate activists who are involved in non-violent but disruptive action, as indeed the suffragettes were, just that question of, so will there be monuments to them in 100 years? How will our views change? Now, I don't know whether I get that to a stage where I could present it from a pulpit, because I think there's so much to it, and there's quite a lot that is controversial and would need thinking through. But I think for any preacher, having that at the back of your mind, it's something I would wrestle with in the rich mix of scriptures we've got this week.
Yeah, and perhaps that question about what would you protest in that way about? What are the things that would make you want to kind of sit and protest, or stand and protest, or however you're going to go about it? What are the issues that for you would create that reaction? I think it's a helpful question perhaps to pose to congregations without perhaps putting them in a place where they feel uncomfortable, although maybe we might want to make congregations uncomfortable sometimes.
That's part of our job.
Yeah.
Discomforting the comfortable.
Absolutely. Wonderful phrase. Any other things from that passage, or I don't know if you wanted to touch on the gospel at all? I know that we've had a really rich conversation from those other passages. But...
Yeah, I of course read the gospel. To help me in this task, I used a wonderful Bible from CAFOD that I was given at a JPIT conference, and it has texts which have anything to do with peace and justice highlighted in orange. I noted that the gospel didn't have any highlighting, so it's my challenge to listeners to this podcast to find that angle. I found the gospel great good news about Jesus coming as the good shepherd, and as hearing the shepherd's voice and following, and the abundance of life that brings. So overall, as a picture of the kingdom. But I couldn't find a hook really to talk about in this podcast particularly.
Well, that's a good challenge to offer to the listeners, isn't it? To find that hook, or to perhaps, as you say, link it in with that shepherding and what does it mean to be a good shepherd, and perhaps offering that example of standing up where we need to stand up for. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom and your reflections with us today. And thanks to everybody else for joining us and for listening in to ask that question of how or whether we ought to be preaching politics in the pulpit this week. If you enjoyed this episode of Politics in the Pulpit, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast and share this episode with your friends. We have some online spaces where you can engage with us further and have some discussion about faith and politics. You can find that on Twitter at pulpit_politics. That's at pulpit_politics, bit of a tongue twister. Or you can use the hashtag politics in the pulpit. We also have a Facebook group where you can access various different conversations and engage with people through the Joint Public Issues Team's Facebook page. That's JPIT. .uk. That's jpit.uk. And the question for this week is about how can you engage in non-violent protest? What are the things that are going to really stir in you to engage in that protest this week or this month? So again, a huge thanks to Rachel for joining us and sharing such wonderful wisdom with us. And let's go out both into our politics and to our pulpits with a blessing this week. So may you be anointed with God's Spirit as you bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, and help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.
Amen. And congratulations on hosting your first Politics in the Pulpit podcast, Ali.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a bit nerve-wracking, but I think it was a good conversation.